Dad, what the hell are you doing?
I left you a note at home.
Yeah, what's it say?
It says I'm sorry.
For what? Dad, if you've relapsed, it's okay. We'll get you help. Chuck saw you earlier.
I wasn't buying drugs.
Passport? You're skipping town?
I'm gonna be a much better father to you from Dominica than I will be from jail.
No, Dad, I know you're scared. But we'll get through the trial.
No, we won't. I'm guilty, Nate. I'm facing 25 years.
So all this stuff about things looking good and working out, huh?
Yeah.
What about Mom?
Who do you think's paying for the private plane?
Why didn't you tell me any of this?
I didn't want you to know anything. Be an accessory. This is the best thing for everyone. I need you to step up right now. Be the man of the family for your mother.
It's been that for a while now.
Nate.
Oh. It's for Mom.
So as requested, Nate Archibald is the next Gossip Girl character I will be analyzing, and I'm going to use one specific storyline in the show that shed light on Nate's character, but also helped us understand what happens to the ultra-wealthy when they suddenly lose their status and find their reputation tarnished. As you can see from the clip I just showed you, Nate was trying to reason with his dad and prevent him from throwing his life away and running from accountability. Nate's dad was going to be found guilty of fraud and embezzlement in that scene, and he also happened to be abusing drugs, which cost him a pretty penny as he has used his own son's trust fund to sustain his addiction. So the Nate we see in this scene is an accurate representation of his character throughout the show. Nate has always been relatively stable and honest. He was caring, kind, and had somewhat of a good moral compass. So granted, Nate has made a few mistakes in the show, but at their age and level of status, that was kind of inevitable. Despite some of his mistakes, Nate was never truly seen as an F-boy because he was kind of a lover boy, and he was never seen as a bad person either, like Chuck, for instance, because Nate often expressed remorse and apologized to the people he hurt. So what really showed Nate's honorable character was the way he handled his father's transgressions, and he usually put ethics over his love for his father in this specific case. So why am I speaking of status disruption or loss of status regarding Nate's analysis? So obviously for those of you who watched the show, you must have remembered the specific case where Nate's father got in trouble with the law and eventually went to jail. So it affected Nate's life to the point where he was sleeping in an empty house on the floor, and he ended up crashing at a few friends' places, including Dan Humphries in Brooklyn. So we also have witnessed a change in Nate's circle of friends and an obvious downward mobility. So downward mobility refers to descending from the social ladder due to factors outside the individual's control, such as family, financial problems, criminal charges, job loss, or economic crisis. In Nate's case, his socioeconomic status dropped suddenly as his family lost tremendous financial capital, housing stability, and social standing. Sociologically speaking, this is usually more destabilizing than poverty from birth because you've already grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle and identity, and you've also internalized the expectation of privilege. So this kind of loss creates a sort of cognitive dissonance because you're telling yourself, I'm supposed to be wealthy, but I'm not. So in real life, this tends to happen to children of white-collar criminals, families affected by bankruptcy, heirs whose trust funds are cut off, and children who are disgraced by politicians or executives. The downward mobility that Nate Archibald experienced was naturally also experienced by his mother, Anne Vanderbilt. Nate's mother had taken a huge reputational hit because of her husband's transgressions, as she fell victim to marginalization and a lack of loyalty in her own social circles. Her friends disappeared and made sure not to be seen with her or be associated with her. She was suddenly kicked out of elite social clubs and in need of money to stay afloat. So she ended up asking a family friend for some financial help, and the family friend happened to be Chuck Bass, which was Nate's best friend. And Nate was extremely embarrassed about it. Now, many of us were asking ourselves, why would Anne Vanderbilt turn to her son's best friend to get her out of this predicament? Well, it is because Anne and her family were estranged because of her marriage to Nate's dad. So the Vanderbilt family never really accepted Howard Archibald, also known as the captain in the show, because they looked down on him. They basically considered him to be new money. He worked in finance and later committed fraud and embezzlement, and he ultimately brought public disgrace on his wife's family. So from an old money Vanderbilt perspective, Howard Archibald represented instability, a social risk, a lack of lineage, legitimacy, and exactly the kind of man you should not marry if you want to preserve class closure. So in the Vanderbilt's eyes, Anne married hypogamously or beneath her social status. So her marriage to Howard Archibald symbolized a rejection of the Vanderbilt norms, and when Howard committed fraud, it confirmed the family's worst fears. So Anne's reluctance to seek help from her family initially reflected a sense of shame, a fear of judgment, pride, and an awareness that her choice of husband cost her financial safety and status preservation. So the downward mobility Nate has experienced was noticeable in him distancing himself from his Upper East Side circle and hanging around his Brooklyn peers such as Dan Humphrey and Vanessa. Nate had a completely different habitus than Dan and Vanessa, but he adapted to their way of living because Nate didn't lose just money, he lost his prestige, his social access, elite belonging, and his golden boy identity. His automatic legitimacy was also kind of revoked in the Upper East Side society. And in sociology, we call this status dislocation, which is when your identity no longer matches your social reality. So this is a perfect example of what sociologists would call status inconsistency as well. As Nate looked like an elite Upper East Side heir, yet he was couch surfing because he had lost tremendous economic capital. Nate, in turn, became too elite for Dan's world and too poor for Blair, Chuck, and Serena's world. So psychologically, this can create a lot of shame, identity confusion, resentment, and a renegotiation of values and relationships. This brings us to Nate having new relationships and suddenly gravitating toward Dan and Vanessa to the point where Nate ended up becoming best friends with Dan and ended up dating Vanessa for a moment in the show. So Nate's intimate circle changed significantly, as well as his romantic prospects, as Vanessa wasn't a part of the Upper East Side. Speaking of which, Nate's relationship with Vanessa didn't last because of a salient phenomenon in Gossip Girl that I've already spoken about, which was status incongruence in many of the couples in the show. I have covered this phenomenon and sociological concept in my previous video pertaining to Dan and Serena and Lily and Rufus's relationship. So Nate and Vanessa is another couple that fell victim to status incongruence as they came from opposite worlds, which made it very difficult for them to sustain their relationship. Once Nate reconnected with his maternal side of the family, which is the Vanderbilt family, his life basically did a 180. His choices and his opportunities and romantic prospects went back to what he's always known. And I am specifically referring to Nate having access to new opportunities, having offers of internship at the mayor's office, being able to access high society networking events and spaces, and easy admission into Ivy League universities such as Yale or Columbia, and the rekindling of his relationship with Blair, who used to be his Upper East Side childhood girlfriend. Now, before I talk about Nate re-entering the Upper East Side thanks to his family ties and his grandfather specifically, who was a Vanderbilt, let's talk about the Vanderbilt family actually. So the Vanderbilt family is a family that is very well known in New York and in US history, and the show basically used this family to basically depict the most prestigious old money families in NYC, in the Upper East Side specifically, to symbolize elite legitimacy, especially in the case of surviving a scandal. So the Vanderbilts are one of America's original Gilded Age dynasties. They are founders of massive wealth through railroads and shipping. They are associated with generational wealth, Ivy League institutions, philanthropy, elite social clubs, and name recognition that functions like social armor. So they represent old money in its purest form with wealth, lineage, and institutional embedding. Nate was able to be saved by the Vanderbilt as his maternal grandfather, being a Vanderbilt, placed him above his father's financial crimes in the social hierarchy. So because Nate's old money status is inherited, it wasn't easily revoked. So while the Archibald name carried a lot of shame, the Vanderbilt name carried enough prestige and power to rescue both Nate and his mom from the Archibald scandal. Although Nate remained generally humble throughout the show, he also represented the epitome of privilege in the show, especially in the face of a scandal. So he experienced status disruption, habitus clashes, and lost social and economic capital temporarily, but the one thing he retained was his cultural capital, the same capital that allowed him to smoothly re-enter elite spaces and resume his lifestyle. So Nathaniel Archibald was a perfect example and representation of status resilience in the show Gossip Girl.